what is the best way to balance gentrification and economic development?
So I think it's extremely important that we make sure that all of our people can access the opportunities of our economy. So for that reason, I'm a very strong supporter of affordable housing, of the government and the federal government creating incentives so that we can get people the opportunity to actually access jobs that we have. In Massachusetts, we actually have hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unfilled because people can't get to them or they don't have the education necessary. It's great that we see things like the recent approval of the extension of the commuter rail down to Fall River. As well, we need to make sure we have more affordable housing closer to the centers of where the businesses are and where the jobs are. So I think our first focus should be on how can we enable our people to get access to these jobs and create the affordable housing for them to do it. Unfortunately, in our state, particularly in our district, it's becoming harder and harder for people to do that.
Yes. Well, look, I think that, speaking of underlying disparities, speaking of things that we've needed to address for a long time, I think the affordable housing crisis is a perfect example of this, that because of redlining, because of systemic discrimination, because of a whole host of factors, not least of which was an education funding formula that led to real disparities in public education, that led to our schools being more segregated today than they were 30 years ago. I think that this is a real critical question in our era and a real failure of the past few decades of leadership. And it's something we need to address. So, look, I was the first candidate in my race to endorse a presidential candidate, and I endorsed Elizabeth Warren. That was for a few reasons, but one of which was that I felt like her proposals for addressing systemic inequality, her focus on affordable housing and on consumer protection, I think was exactly the direction we need to go in. She said that, we needed to change the estate tax, what conservatives often call the death tax, which when George W. Bush left office was, the threshold was about half what it is now. And if we went back to that, I mean, it's still multimillionaires estates that we're talking about here, by the way, people who are very well off. If we just ask them to pay a little bit more and we plow that back into affordable housing construction, I think that's to everyone's benefit. In the same way that I think what I love about the Green New Deal is that it recognizes that you can't really talk about environmental justice. You can't talk about social justice without environmental justice. You can't talk about the green economy without also talking about transportation. And you can't talk about those issues without talking about housing. And I think all of these issues have to be addressed substantively together. And I'm glad that the legislature in Massachusetts is thinking about options like rent control. But I think the only way to really address, to your point, gentrification, to really create broad-based growth so that every community is a place where people want to live and raise a family and start their careers, is to fix this all. We need to fix our education system so that every school is a great school. We need to fix transportation so that our cities are walkable, so that you can get from place to place on high-speed rail, and you don't have to use a car to get everywhere. There's a whole set of things we need to do, but I'm really glad that attention is being paid to this issue finally.
Yeah, so when I was in Chelsea, it was a very low-income community, and even during my time there, it changed drastically. The lavish apartments were built across the street from a number of methadone clinics. There was a number of ODs across from some really expensive high-rises that are going up. And I see firsthand how this is putting huge economic pressure on my students, because as the value of the property goes up, the rent increases, and now I literally have students who have to study in bathtubs because the rent is so expensive. I think there is a tension, and there always will be a tension between people's needs and the economy. And this is the reoccurring theme that I see with my campaign is there is no easy solution. It's going to be nuanced and it's going to be complex. And frankly, I think the only solution that we can have is to have essentially a universal housing model that puts housing first, that we have subsidized rentals for people in low-income brackets, that we provide housing for homeless, so that they can actually have the emotional and physical foundations that they need to get on their feet and succeed. And that's the only solution that we can have where we both meet the needs of people and also the economy.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think an example of what's happening in the district would be when I spoke with folks from Fall River about the the South Coast Rail. Many were, in huge agreement. They've wanted it for generations, and other people were concerned about gentrification in a way that bringing, very effective, speedy, green public transportation that would link the Fall River community to Boston and to the other northern parts of the district would actually force communities to leave their homes, because homes are getting more expensive in Boston, as you may know. And so folks who cannot afford Boston would start to move to other public transit accessible areas that have a lower cost of housing, and that would be a city like Fall River. Now, the issue starts to show that once you think about transportation, you have to think about housing, right, and about affordable housing. I am a Green New Deal candidate, and within the Green New Deal, we are advocating for the federal homes guarantee, federal green homes guarantee, and that means building 12 million units, affordable units across the country. And I would bring a lot of funding into my districts to make sure that we are preventing gentrification via providing affordable housing in areas that need them the most.
Well, I think we have an affordable housing crisis. And again, the COVID-19 crisis is showing this, because if you're homeless, you can't, you get the infection, you don't get care, you don't even have an address. We have to deal with it. And there's a lot we can do. First of all, we should allow people who are on Section 8 to keep getting their subsidies as they get income so that they can save money until they can transition to their own affordable housing. The way it works now is a mess. We have to build more housing. We have to get back where the federal government is providing the funding so that we can build more housing. We have to make sure that we allow people to, while they're getting benefits, save them so they can pay for rent. We also have to have a commitment that we will expand opportunities in the neighborhoods where there are housing shortages. So there's a lot we can do. The answer is to build more affordable housing, and that will also deal with the gentrification problem. The other thing we need to do is make sure that we're supporting inner city businesses so that we have economic growth that's expanding across low-income areas so that gentrification is not as big of an issue.
I've been a champion for housing on the Newton City Council. I'm a member of the Land Use Committee, have been for 5 years, and have been very involved in some of the most controversial housing projects in Massachusetts, both at Riverside, at Northland, at Washington Place. In all cases, I have taken hard votes to build more housing in Newton, and I have also pushed hard on developers to do two things that have increased the affordability of units. One is to have a higher inclusionary zoning threshold, meaning that a higher percentage of the housing units that are built are deed restricted as affordable. And the second is to cut down their parking spots. Parking is a little noticed but deeply impactful element of zoning that creates higher cost housing and also exacerbates our climate change and sustainability goals here in the city. So I've been a champion of housing and economic development in Newton, one that is both inclusive as well as pro-growth, and I'll continue to be in Congress.
Look, we're seeing some of that gentrification near Northeastern, near Ruggles, right? Like that's been happening over a long time. Look, I sat on the board of the Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. I was going to that location all the time. And in fact, I've spoken at Northeastern many, many times as the president of the Hispanic National Bar Association. So I see what's going on. And the way that you work with gentrification, but housing in general, is a holistic approach. You need affordable housing. You need subsidized housing. You need market rate housing. You need workforce housing. You also have to make sure that the zoning laws are more more flexible, and you have to give incentives to developers. So you need all those pieces in order to revise a plan that is energy efficient, that is socially just, and that has housing that's also accessible to transportation. It's not one size fits all, it's all those pieces together.
I think that the state of Massachusetts approach of giving developers a break with their zoning and other issues, if they have some percentage of affordable housing in their apartments, is the best way to go. The federal approaches of having segregated low-income communities has not worked out well because they turn out to be high crime areas. They don't help the low-income people get the connections they need to move their lives ahead.
Yeah, it's a hard challenge, and it's not just about housing, right? It's also about how we're investing our commercial dollars. There's no question that as we invest in areas that have been underserved, we need to put protections in place to prevent gentrification. That means when we invest money to expand our transportation network, that means when we invest money in commercial dollars, that means when we invest money in affordable housing. It's not just housing that leads to gentrification. You know, I think that there are things around rent stabilization and rent control in certain neighborhoods that do make good sense. If you look what happened in Mexico City when they expanded their bus rapid transit system, they will readily admit that, particularly in the beginning, they did a very bad job of planning for gentrification. And what they meant to do, to invest in transportation in communities that had been left behind, wound up hurting some of the very people that we were trying to help. And I fear that some of the same things could happen, not just in Boston, but in greater Boston and throughout the 4th Congressional District. It doesn't mean we don't make those much needed transportation and housing and commercial development investments. That is not a valid excuse. It means we have to be smart and strategic in planning those investments and putting protections in place that make sure that the people we're trying to lift up, that we're trying to make sure have a path forward, aren't unintentionally hurt by what is hopefully well-intentioned progress.
So the question around gentrification lends itself to a question around affordable housing. As a health expert, as someone who studies the social conditions in which health and wellness is created, I know that being able to have affordable and quality housing is key to well-being. And that means that we need to invest in neighborhoods that are mixed income and enable everybody to be able to live in them. So we need more affordable housing options. We need to think about rent stabilized housing across the district. It's not just some neighborhoods, it's everywhere. I live in Brookline Village, and I know how unaffordable that is for so many people across District 4. And I know how unfair that is, unjust, and also how bad it is for the well-being of the community, the diversity, and the values that we hope to espouse by being part of Massachusetts and welcoming everybody.
Well, we absolutely need to be increasing the supply of housing in this country. The affordable housing crisis certainly is before us here in Massachusetts and is a major problem in this country that continues to exacerbate economic and healthcare inequities. In every community that I have visited across the 4th District, the urgent need for more affordable housing comes up and is top of mind. And we see how across the 4th District and the country, people are often forced to choose between the roof over their head or receiving quality healthcare or the ability to put food on the table. And that cannot be accepted as normal. On the Newton City Council, I've been a strong advocate for affordable housing and transit-oriented development. And I think that efforts that municipalities are and should be making need to be bolstered by the federal government, which has a key role to play in directly increasing the supply of public affordable housing through investments and through incentives. And Congress and the next administration can go a lot further by ending redlining and housing discrimination on the basis of race and sexual orientation, boosting incentives for developers to build affordable homes rather than luxury single-family homes, prioritizing transit-oriented development through tax incentives to be able to connect people to where the job opportunities are while simultaneously tackling our climate goals, and targeting investments to communities of color who have been historically victimized by housing discrimination.